The night was thick with mist on June 13, 1942, when the dark silhouette of U-202 broke the surface off the coast of Long Island. For hours, it had prowled silently beneath the waves, waiting for the moment to strike. Now, under a moon obscured by clouds, 4 men clambered into a rubber raft, their boots crunching against the salt-soaked hull. The Atlantic surf hissed around them as they paddled toward the American shore. In their packs lay explosives, incendiary devices, and bundles of U.S. currency. Their mission was not to fight pitched battles, but to sow chaos, to cripple America's war machine from within. Once on the beach near Amagansett, the men worked quickly. They buried their German uniforms deep in the sand, concealing all trace of their military origins. Civilian clothes replaced them, slacks, shirts, and hats that might allow them to melt into the crowds of New York. Their names were George John Dash, Heinrich Heinck, Ernest Berger, and Richard Quirin, all German-born, some having lived in America before the war. They had been handpicked by the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, for an operation designed to terrorize the U.S. home front. The night was eerie, the silence broken only by the distant hum of waves and the faint growl of the U-boat's diesel engines preparing to slip back into the Atlantic. One of the men muttered that the sand felt softer than he remembered, almost welcoming. Another kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting an American patrol to appear. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind a threat. They carried with them more than explosives. They carried Hitler's ambition to strike at the heart of the United States. Operation Pastorius had begun. The plan was bold, almost audacious. The saboteurs were tasked with destroying key economic targets across the country. Their list included hydroelectric facilities at Niagara Falls, aluminum plants in Illinois and Tennessee, chemical factories in New Jersey, and even railroads critical to transporting war materiel. Each target had been carefully selected to weaken America's capacity to arm itself and its allies. With the United States newly at war after Pearl Harbor, the Reich sought to remind Americans that no ocean was wide enough to keep them safe. But the landing was far from flawless. The surf was heavier than expected, and as the men dragged their equipment ashore, one crate nearly overturned in the waves. Worse still, as they labored in the sand dunes, a figure suddenly appeared. A lone Coast Guardsman on patrol. Seaman John Cullen, lantern in hand, stumbled upon the group. Startled, the Germans improvised. Dash, thinking quickly, tried to bluff his way out, claiming they were fishermen stranded ashore. He slipped several bills of cash into Cullen's hand, urging him to forget what he had seen. The young Coast Guardsman, unnerved but determined, left to report the incident. By then, however, the saboteurs had already vanished into the fog. For the Germans, this narrow escape underscored the danger of their mission. They were now enemies in disguise on foreign soil, hunted if discovered. They carried documents forged to pass American scrutiny, and a staggering sum of money meant to fund months of sabotage. Their orders were clear: spread fear, disrupt production, and force the Americans to look inward rather than toward the battlefields of Europe. Back across the Atlantic, Berlin viewed Operation Pastorius as an act of psychological warfare. Hitler, furious at America's entry into the war, demanded that the Reich strike directly at the U.S. industrial heart. It was a desperate gamble. Germany's naval power was stretched thin, its U-boats already engaged in a brutal campaign against Allied shipping. Yet the Führer insisted on carrying the war to American soil, imagining that panic would erupt and resources would be diverted from the fight abroad. For the men on the beach, however, the reality was far less grandiose. Cold, wet, and nervous, they trudged inland toward Long Island's quiet roads, their breath misting in the pre-dawn air. Dash would later recall that every farmhouse light seemed to pierce their disguise, every barking dog a signal of exposure. The seeds of sabotage had been planted, but their success depended on secrecy. Secrecy that was already slipping away. Cullen's report would soon alert the FBI, setting into motion a chain of events that would unravel Operation Pastorius before it could strike its first blow. Yet in that moment, under the shroud of night, the saboteurs believed they carried the fate of nations in their hands. The surf washed over the buried uniforms, erasing the evidence of their arrival. The U-boat melted back into the sea, leaving the four men alone on hostile ground. For America, the war had just landed on its shores, and, for the saboteurs, the long shadow of betrayal was already creeping closer. The surf of Long Island had barely swallowed the footprints of the saboteurs when the story rewinds to its origins, thousands of miles away in a Germany bracing for total war. By early 1942, the Reich's fortunes had shifted. America had entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, and the industrial might of the United States loomed as a decisive threat. To Hitler's high command, striking the American homeland became more than a dream. It became a necessity. It was within this climate that the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, was tasked with a daring plan. Headed by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, a man of contradictions who outwardly served the Reich but quietly doubted its course, the Abwehr specialized in espionage and sabotage. Under Canaris's direction, planners designed Operation Pastorius, an effort to cripple American production and sow fear across the Atlantic. The Abwehr sought men who could move unnoticed in American streets, men who spoke English without suspicion and who understood the rhythms of American life. The pool of candidates was narrow, but not non-existent. Many German Americans had returned to the Reich before the war, some out of loyalty, others out of circumstance. 8 were eventually chosen. Their names were George John Dash, Heinrich Heinck, Richard Quirin, Ernest Berger, Edward Kerling, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, and Herbert Haupt. All were of German birth, but several had lived in the United States long enough to know its geography, its trains, and even its slang. Training began in earnest in a secluded camp outside Berlin. Hidden in the forests, far from the eyes of civilians, the site resembled a hybrid of military barracks and industrial workshop. Here, the recruits were drilled in the clandestine arts of sabotage. They learned how to handle dynamite and incendiary devices, how to wire detonators with precision, and how to conceal explosives in everyday objects. They practiced with timers that could delay blasts by hours, enabling escape before discovery. Manuals instructed them in railway demolition, factory arson, and the subtle art of blending into crowds. The atmosphere at the camp was tense, filled with the weight of expectation. One instructor later noted that not all of the recruits were enthusiastic. A few harbored doubts about attacking the very country where they had once lived and worked. Yet dissent had little place in Nazi Germany. To refuse was to invite suspicion, and suspicion often meant imprisonment, or worse. Daily life was a blend of military routine and covert instruction. Recruits rose early, marched drills, and spent hours in classrooms memorizing the details of their targets. The list was ambitious. The saboteurs were to strike at hydroelectric plants near Niagara Falls, destroy aluminum factories in Illinois and Tennessee, and cripple rail lines that carried coal and steel. In New York, they were tasked with targeting the Hell Gate Bridge, a vital artery for freight and troop movements along the eastern seaboard. If successful, the strikes could disrupt American production at a critical moment, delaying supplies destined for Britain and the Soviet Union. For the men, the weight of their mission was clear. Some kept their thoughts to themselves. Others muttered about the impossibility of carrying it out. Dash, the eldest of the group, confided privately that the plan seemed doomed from the start. He had lived in America and knew its resilience. But still, he trained, pocketing his doubts behind a mask of discipline. By May 1942, preparations reached their climax. Each saboteur was issued civilian clothes, forged documents, and thousands of dollars in American currency. They were instructed to travel in pairs, blend into American society, and work independently once ashore. Their insertion would be via U-boat, the silent predators of the Atlantic that prowled Allied shipping lanes with ruthless efficiency. The journey from Berlin to the submarines was conducted under utmost secrecy. The men traveled in small groups, told little of the broader strategy. Even among themselves, conversation was sparse, as though speaking too freely might shatter the fragile illusion of confidence. Boarding their submarines in French ports, the saboteurs descended into the cramped steel hulls that would carry them across the Atlantic. Conditions aboard were suffocating. Air was heavy with diesel fumes, and every bunk was shared by 2 or 3 men in shifts. Torpedoes lined the passageways, and the constant threat of Allied patrols meant days spent submerged, the crew silent except for the hum of engines. For the saboteurs, it was a voyage of uncertainty, each mile closer to America, tightening the coil of anxiety. In Berlin, the mixed, and the very leader of the Abwehr, Admiral Canaris, harbored doubts about Hitler's grand strategy, doubts that would one day make him a conspirator against the Reich. By early June, the first submarine closed in on Long Island, its crew bracing for the dangerous task of landing saboteurs on an enemy shore. The men rehearsed their instructions one final time, their explosives carefully packed, their nerves fraying. Above them, the Atlantic waves rolled under a moonless sky. The operation that had begun in a secluded German forest was now poised to cross into enemy territory. The U-boats carried not just saboteurs, but Hitler's hope of striking fear into America itself. The dark Atlantic rolled against the American coast as history unfolded in silence. In the early hours of June 13, 1942, the first U-boat of Operation Pastorius surfaced off Amagansett, Long Island. Its steel hull glistened under a pale moon, and 4 men emerged into the chill night. They lowered a rubber raft loaded with crates of explosives, incendiary devices, and bundles of American currency and began paddling toward the shore. The surf was shallow, but the stakes were immense. Their orders were clear: sabotage American factories, railways, and power plants, and ignite a campaign of fear that would rattle the U.S. homeland. Once ashore, the men buried their German uniforms in the dunes, a symbolic severing of ties with their homeland, and a desperate attempt to vanish into civilian life. Their leader, George John Dash, carried both authority and doubt. As he pressed the sand over the hidden uniforms, he muttered to one of his comrades that this plan, like the moonlight on the waves, might not survive the dawn. The operation repeated days later along Florida's Ponte Vedra beach. On June 17th, another U-boat surfaced, releasing 4 more saboteurs under equally tense conditions. Here, too, the men carried dynamite, detonators, and a mission to cripple critical infrastructure. They concealed their supplies among the dunes and quickly moved inland. The 2 teams, one in New York, the other in Florida, were instructed to spread out, establish false identities, and reconvene weeks later to coordinate their campaign of destruction. They had been given American money to live as civilians and forged papers to move without arousing suspicion. Yet, the reality of infiltrating wartime America was far harsher than their Abwehr instructors had prepared them for. On Long Island, Dash's group immediately faced its first test. As they stumbled up the dunes, they were confronted by an unexpected figure: John Cullen, a young Coast Guardsman on night patrol. Startled, Dash improvised a desperate ruse, pressing bribe money into Cullen's hand and threatening him with violence if he spoke of the encounter. Cullen, shaken but resolute, returned to his station and reported what he had seen. By dawn, the U.S. Coast Guard had uncovered the buried explosives. Already, the mission's cover was fraying. Meanwhile, the Florida team blended more smoothly into civilian life, but the strain was no less heavy. They checked into local hotels, shaved, bought new clothes, and tried to pass as businessmen or travelers. Every glance from a shopkeeper, every question at a train station carried with it the weight of discovery. One later recalled that simply ordering a meal in a restaurant felt like an interrogation. The saboteurs' instructions were sweeping but lacked precision. They were told to target factories producing aluminum, bridges vital to troop and supply transport, and even department stores to spark civilian panic. Yet behind the bravado of these orders lay a sobering reality. 8 men, isolated and uncertain, tasked with waging a war of shadows in a nation already mobilizing for total conflict. Morale fractured quickly. Some were zealous, still committed to Hitler's cause. Others, like Dash, harbored deep ambivalence. Having lived in America for years, he felt uneasy about destroying the country that had once given him a home. Conflicting loyalties brewed beneath the surface, poisoning trust within the groups. Dash, in particular, seemed to grow more anxious by the day, weighing the impossible choices before him. In the bustling streets of New York City, just a train ride from their landing site, American life carried on oblivious to the danger. Factories roared day and night, turning out aircraft engines, ammunition, and ships for the Allied cause. The saboteurs walked those same streets, carrying secret caches of explosives, and yet they seemed almost swallowed by the sheer immensity of American society. German records later revealed that the Abwehr had overestimated both the men's training and their capacity to remain unnoticed. The United States in 1942 was no longer a neutral country. It was a nation at war, its citizens vigilant, its security services alert. The saboteurs soon realized that every movement carried risk. Every word could betray them. FBI files and post-war confessions exposed the fragility of the mission from its very beginning. Far from being a well-oiled operation, Pistorius teetered on the brink of collapse the moment boots touched American sand. The explosives, though expertly concealed, were compromised almost instantly. The bribes and threats of secrecy only drew more suspicion, and the men themselves, divided by doubt, by fear, and by conflicting loyalties, carried within them the seeds of failure. What had begun with moonlit landings on Long Island and Florida now unfolded, against the backdrop of American cities alive with war production. The saboteurs' plan to cripple America's war machine was already unraveling, and the FBI's net was beginning to close. The moonlit landings on Long Island and Florida had barely faded into memory when cracks began to splinter Operation Pastorius from the inside. Among the 8 saboteurs, none carried more weight on his shoulders than their leader, George John Dash, a German-born man who had spent years in the United States. Dash was already torn between 2 worlds before he ever set foot on American soil again. Now, burdened with explosives, forged papers, and a mission to bring chaos to the country that had once sheltered him, he made a choice that would decide the fate of all. For days after the Long Island landing, Dash brooded in silence. While his comrades spoke of targets and timetables, he drifted into doubt. He despised elements of the Nazi regime and harbored little faith in Germany's chances of winning a total war. More than ideology, however, it was survival and ambition that gnawed at him. If caught, the punishment was certain death. If successful, the mission would earn him nothing but notoriety as a foreign agent. But if he betrayed it, perhaps, just perhaps, he could secure safety, and even a place in American history. On June 19, 1942, only 6 days after stepping ashore, Dash took the most extraordinary gamble of his life. Carrying a briefcase filled with incriminating evidence, he boarded a train bound for Washington, D.C. His destination was not an explosive target, but the very heart of America's security, the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Inside the J. Edgar Hoover building, agents were stunned when Dash introduced himself. Speaking calmly but with a nervous intensity, he announced that he was part of a German sabotage mission. and that he wanted to turn himself in. At first, the FBI believed he was a crank, one of many who had flooded their offices with wild claims since the United States entered the war. But when Dash produced bundles of American currency, codes, and the details of his fellow operatives, the truth became undeniable. Transcripts of his initial interrogation reveal the strange atmosphere of that confession. Dash spoke with a mixture of pride and relief, laying out the Abwehr's training program, the targets assigned, and the identities of each of the men he had brought with him. One agent later recalled that Dash leaned forward across the table and whispered, "I am here to save myself, but I will also save your country." The FBI moved quickly. Under Hoover's direction, surveillance was ordered on the saboteurs in both New York and Florida. Within days, the Bureau rounded them up, catching most by surprise in hotels and apartments. Some went quietly. Others protested that they had not yet committed a crime, but their fate had already been sealed by Dash's words. While the United States scrambled to process this sudden infiltration, in Berlin, the Abwehr remained oblivious. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, already juggling the dangerous politics of Hitler's intelligence services, still believed Operation Pastorius was active. Reports from his agents indicated that the saboteurs had landed successfully. German High Command expected results soon. Explosions, fires, and terror across the American industrial heartland. Instead, their carefully chosen operatives now sat in FBI custody. Dash's betrayal has puzzled historians for decades. Was it truly conscience that drove him? Revulsion at Nazi ideology? And a refusal to carry out acts of terror on American soil? Or was it calculation, a desperate maneuver to save his own life before the net closed? Some records suggest that Dash fancied himself a man destined for greatness, believing his actions would eventually be recognized as heroic. Others argue he feared his fellow saboteurs would turn on him first, and so he struck preemptively. Whatever the mix of motives, the effect was undeniable. The largest Nazi sabotage mission against the United States collapsed without a single bomb detonated. For the men who had trained alongside him in Berlin, Dash's confession was a death sentence. They were captured, tried by military tribunal, and condemned. In a twist that revealed the precarious morality of espionage, Dash himself was spared execution. Instead, he became both a prisoner and an informant, his life defined by the choice he had made in that FBI office. The betrayal was more than the downfall of 8 men. It was a turning point in America's confrontation with Nazi espionage. Hoover seized on the incident to demonstrate the FBI's vigilance, presenting the arrests as a triumph of American intelligence rather than the result of a German defection. To the public, the story was one of menace swiftly extinguished. To the Germans, it was silence, an operation swallowed by the shadows, its failure concealed from their commanders until much later. Dash's choice, born of doubt and desperation, had reshaped the battlefield. Without a single explosion, Operation Pastorius had imploded from within, undone not by the strength of America's defenses, but by the wavering loyalty of its leader. The stage was now set for the dramatic trials that would follow, where justice, propaganda, and wartime fear collided in a courtroom that determined not only the saboteurs' fate, but the meaning of espionage on American soil. George John Dash's confession had cracked Operation Pastorius wide open, but the work of dismantling the network was only beginning. Armed with names, descriptions, and hiding places, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI moved with speed and precision. In a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, the thought of Nazi saboteurs wandering freely on American soil was intolerable. The Bureau's response would be both swift and decisive, and carefully orchestrated to display Hoover as the vigilant guardian of the home front. By June 20th, 1942, FBI field offices in New York and Washington had received orders to locate and arrest the saboteurs before they could vanish into the crowded anonymity of American cities. Agents combed through hotels, train stations, and boarding houses, guided by Dash's meticulous account of his team's movements. In New York, 2 saboteurs were found lounging in their hotel rooms, caught completely unprepared. One agent later reported that they surrendered in disbelief, as though the walls had closed in faster than they could think. In Florida, the arrests unfolded with greater tension. The team that had landed at Ponte Vedra Beach was attempting to make its way north, blending into the stream of wartime travelers. But the Bureau was already waiting. At a quiet rail station, agents closed in, their revolvers hidden beneath newspapers and coats. Within moments, the second group was in custody. Not a shot had been fired. The sabotage campaign collapsed with scarcely a ripple of resistance. For Hoover, this was not simply a successful counterintelligence operation. It was an opportunity. Within days of the arrests, the FBI issued carefully crafted press releases, portraying the Bureau as having broken the Nazi sabotage plot through skill and vigilance. The role of Dash's betrayal was largely buried. To the American public, the story was clear. Federal agents had outsmarted the Abwehr and shielded the nation from disaster. Still, beneath the surface triumph, there was unease. Interrogation transcripts reveal the atmosphere in FBI offices as agents questioned the prisoners late into the night. Some saboteurs clung to bravado, insisting they were soldiers, not criminals. Others broke quickly, confessing details in exchange for leniency. Dash himself repeated his story with almost theatrical flair, casting himself as both traitor and savior. One agent later described the atmosphere as a mixture of farce and menace. Men who carried explosives now reduced to bargaining for their lives. As news of the arrests spread, paranoia rippled across American cities. Newspapers blared headlines of Nazi agents caught plotting destruction from within. Rumors multiplied. Whispers of other U-boats offshore, of hidden cells waiting for orders. Families locked their doors earlier at night. Factory managers increased patrols around power plants and bridges. For many Americans, the saboteurs' swift capture was reassuring. But it also confirmed a frightening truth. The war had reached their shores. In Berlin, the Abwehr remained oblivious for weeks. Reports filtering back suggested the men had landed successfully and were preparing operations. German high command waited for explosions, for railroads to burn, and factories to go dark. Instead, silence stretched on. By the time the truth reached them, the operation was not only lost, it had become a humiliating showcase of American counterintelligence. For Hoover, however, the outcome was a gift. He presented the arrests to President Roosevelt as evidence of the FBI's indispensable role in wartime security. Publicly, Hoover cast himself as the vigilant watchman who had foiled Hitler's attempt to bring the war to America. In reality, it had been Dash's choice that had handed the Bureau its victory. Yet the myth of FBI brilliance served a crucial purpose, reinforcing American confidence that the homeland could withstand the enemy's reach. By the end of June 1942, all 8 saboteurs sat behind bars. The speed of their capture underscored both the vulnerability and the resilience of the United States. Nazi Germany had tried to strike the American heart from within, but the attempt had disintegrated almost as soon as it began. The arrest set the stage for the final act of Operation Pastorius, a trial unlike any other, where espionage, betrayal, and wartime fear collided. In a courtroom that would determine not only the fate of the saboteurs but also the future of how America confronted enemies in its midst. The swift collapse of Operation Pastorius had left 8 captured men in American custody, but their fate was far from settled. In the tense summer of 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a dilemma. Were these men soldiers, entitled to prisoner-of-war protections, Or were they criminals, saboteurs, who had abandoned uniforms and crept ashore in civilian clothes? Roosevelt made his choice clear. They would not be tried in open court. But before a military tribunal convened in Washington, D.C., it was a decision born of wartime urgency, one that would shape American law for generations. In late July, the saboteurs were transferred under heavy guard to the Department of Justice building, where the tribunal was set up in strict secrecy. The courtroom was windowless, its doors locked against the press. Soldiers with fixed bayonets stood outside. The accused sat in rows, guarded closely, their faces drawn and pale under the harsh lights. Each wore plain clothing, stripped of any pretense of military dignity. The government was determined to make an example of them. Major General Myron C. Kramer, the judge advocate for Dash and Berger, prison replaced the execution chamber. Dash, ever defiant, believed he deserved recognition as a hero for betraying the mission. Instead, he was condemned by both sides, a traitor to his comrades, a criminal to many Americans. He would live in obscurity, a man caught between two worlds, remembered only in the shadows of history. The Tribunal of 1942 was more than the end of Operation Pastorius. It was a defining moment in how the United States confronted espionage and sabotage on its soil. In the sealed courtroom of Washington, the government drew a line between war and terror, between soldier and spy. And in doing so, it sent a chilling message to those who sought to bring Hitler's war to America's shores. They would not return alive. With the executions complete, the curtain fell on Hitler's first attempt to strike the American homeland. But the legacy of the tribunal, its secrecy, its speed, its precedent, would linger, shaping how America fought enemies from within long after the war ended. The story of Operation Pastorius closed not with explosions and sabotage, but with silence, a failed mission buried beneath the weight of betrayal and swift American justice. Its legacy, however, endured far beyond the summer of 1942. What began with two U-boats surfacing off the American coast became a defining episode in the struggle between open societies and covert subversion. For Nazi Germany, the operation reflected both ambition and desperation. The Reich sought to strike at the heart of American industry just months after the United States had entered the war. Targets such as hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls, the Hell Gate Bridge in New York, and the sprawling factories of the Midwest promised chaos if destroyed. Yet the reality of America, vast, alert, and resilient, proved far harder to penetrate. The saboteurs carried bundles of dollars and crates of explosives, but they could not navigate the moral and psychological terrain of a country mobilized for war. In the United States, the affair left a profound imprint. The rapid unraveling of the plot underscored the effectiveness of federal intelligence when combined with public vigilance. Newspapers blared headlines of Nazi spies caught, feeding both fear and reassurance. Citizens were reminded that the war could reach their neighborhoods, yet also that the government stood ready to defend them. J. Edgar Hoover, ever eager for publicity, seized on the case to reinforce his image as the vigilant guardian of the home front. Legally, Pastorius marked a turning point. Roosevelt's decision to try the saboteurs before a military tribunal, upheld by the Supreme Court in ex parte Quirin, created a precedent that stretched across decades. The ruling distinguished lawful combatants from unlawful ones, men who fought in uniform versus those who shed it for sabotage. That line, drawn in 1942, would later re-emerge in debates over how to confront spies, terrorists, and enemy combatants in conflicts far beyond the Second World War. For the saboteurs themselves, their fate was grim and unambiguous. 6 went to the electric chair in Washington, D.C., their mission remembered not as valor but as a cautionary tale. George Dash and Ernst Berger, who had cooperated with the FBI, spent years in prison before release and eventual obscurity. Dash, in particular, struggled to recast himself as a man who had saved America, but history judged him more as a betrayer than a hero. The broader legacy of Operation Pastorius lay in its failure. It revealed the limits of Germany's reach, the vulnerability of covert operations launched from across the ocean, and the resilience of American society when confronted with danger. The U-boats that had once prowled close to U.S. shores gradually lost their advantage, hunted down by Allied aircraft and destroyers. The vision of German saboteurs crippling American war production never materialized. Instead, America's factories roared to life, supplying weapons, ships, and aircraft on a scale that overwhelmed the Axis. And yet, the image lingers. A quiet June night on Long Island. The surf breaking on the shore. A rubber raft scraping onto the sand. 4 men burying their uniforms, convinced they had brought fear to America's doorstep. In truth, their footsteps faded into the vastness of a country that refused to be intimidated. Operation Pastorius endures as a reminder that wars are not fought solely with tanks and divisions. They are waged in the shadows, through sabotage, deception, loyalty, and betrayal. In those shadows, the fate of nations can shift. For the men who stepped onto that beach in 1942, the war ended not in glory but in failure. Their mission extinguished almost as soon as it began. And as the U-boat slipped back beneath the waves that night, it left behind not a wave of terror, but the echo of a lesson. Even the most ambitious schemes can collapse when they underestimate the resilience of the human spirit and the vigilance of a nation at war.